Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Peace, Illicit Economies and Development, Pathways Out of Conflict in the Borderlands. This webinar is the latest in the excellent series of virtual events that have made up the 2020 Fragility Forum. My name's Karen Brock, and I'm Policy Engagement and Research Uptake Coordinator for Drugs and Disorder, a 4-year research project being carried out in Afghanistan, Colombia and Myanmar, funded by the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund. Our research consortium of 12 partners is led by SOAS University of London, and it also includes Christian Aid, who have worked behind the scenes with the World Bank to convene the 2 sessions of the Fragility Forum about this research, of which this one is the first. Drugs and Disorder is gathering evidence to contribute to answering the question, how can war economies be transformed into peace economies? It's based on the premise that we need new approaches to tackling illicit drug economies in conflict-affected countries, particularly in their borderland areas. Drugs and Disorder is producing rigorous research in Afghanistan, Colombia and Myanmar, and building and strengthening networks of researchers working on illicit drug economies within and beyond those countries. In Colombia, our research focuses on production, and we're talking to coca growers and pickers in the borderland areas of Santa Marta, Tumaco and Puerto Asís. In Afghanistan, the focus is on trafficking and trade, and we're talking to opium traders and transporters in Nangarhar in the east and Nimroz in the west. In Myanmar, we're looking at drug consumption, talking to members of communities affected by rising levels of drug use in Shan and Kachin states in the northeast. I'm really pleased to be moderating today's session, entitled Peace, Illicit Economies, Development, Pathways Out of Conflict in the Borderlands, in which we'll hear from the Drugs and Disorder research team about some of the findings from the research and their implications. In our second session, next Thursday, August the 13th, Drugs and Disorders Principal Investigator, Professor Jonathan Goodhand, will be joined for a live panel discussion about the implications of the research by guests from Brookings Institute, CIPRI and Christian Aid. Recordings of both sessions will be available on demand from the World Bank's Open Learning Campus platform, together with a range of content from Drugs and Disorder, including our recent report, Voices from the Borderlands, and a policy brief. There's also the first in a series of comics and animations we're producing, sharing the life histories of ordinary people involved in different ways in illicit economies in Afghanistan, Colombia and Myanmar. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to today's panelists. Orzala Nemat is an internationally known Afghan activist and scholar, an expert in political ethnography, with research interests in development and conflict, governance and borderland studies. She's the director of the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, one of the partners in the Afghanistan Drugs and Disorder Research. So welcome, Orzala. Patrick Meehan is Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS University of London. His research explores violence, conflict and development in Myanmar's borderlands, and he's co-investigator on drugs and disorder. Welcome, Patrick. Francisco Gutiérrez is Professor at the Institute of Politics and International Relations at the National University of Colombia. He's worked and published on patterns of violence against civilians, statehood and state fragility, and he leads the Colombia research on drugs and disorder. Welcome, Francisco. Jasmine Bhatia is Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS University of London. Her research interests include civil wars, insurgent movements, and subnational political settlements in violent contexts, and she works on the drugs and disorder research in Afghanistan. But today she's going to provide us with an overview of some of what the research is finding across all 3 countries. So we'll turn first to Jasmine to ask, can you tell us a little more about the focus of the drugs and disorder research?
Thanks, Karen. They're all 3 countries where we're working, Myanmar, Colombia, and Afghanistan, have experienced years of violent conflict and have some form of ongoing peace process underway. Together, they also account for approximately 80% of global illicit opium production and about 70% of global cocaine production. Finally, in each country, borderland areas are very important. They're hubs in transnational drug economies, sites where illicit drugs are trafficked out. So our research looks at the relationship between illicit drug economies, state fragility, and post-war transitions in these borderland regions, examining the role of illicit economies in wartime, their perpetuation in peacetime, and the complex dilemmas and trade-offs that exist between peace building, development, and counter-narcotics efforts.
Jasmine, can you tell us a little more about why borderlands are important and how they're usually seen?
Sure. As I mentioned, borderlands are particularly important, one, because they are hubs in transnational drug economies, but more than that, they're important because of their political and economic dimensions. So politically and economically, they shape national level political settlements and generate often very large capital flows that reconfigure urban centers and landscapes, but also change political dynamics and power relationships between stakeholders. According to conventional views, borderlands are often stereotyped as unruly and lawless, populated by criminal and rebel groups. Violence and criminality is attributed typically to a lack of state presence and the failure of these border regions to be integrated into formal markets. But seeing borderlands in this way, we are arguing, is somewhat simplistic and misleading. It obscures, for example, the structural inequalities that contribute to conflict, drive drug economies, and present ordinary people living in borderlands with tough economic trade-offs in order to survive. Our research shows that borderlands are not disconnected. Instead, their marginality is often actively created through policies and discourses that come from the center. And rather than being regions that lag behind, they are transformative spaces in which borderland communities assert their agency. As such, we argue that sustainable pathways out of conflict need to be rooted in an understanding of the social, political, and economic dimensions of borderlands and what processes of development and peace building look like when they actually play out in borderland areas. We hope our research contributes to this understanding, offering a detailed perspective rooted in the borderlands based on hundreds of interviews with people involved in drug production, trade, and consumption.
What light do these borderland perspectives shed on the relationship between peace, illicit economies, and development?
So they show how, one, illicit drug economies are very important in shaping both formal peace processes and informal political settlements between warring parties. Two, post-war borderlands experience multiple types of violence linked to both licit and illicit economies. In some places, the spread of drugs and associated harms worsens in times of peace. And finally, conflict and illicit economies are deeply embedded in the lives and livelihoods of borderland communities, contributing to complex trade-offs between people's short-term coping and survival strategies and their long-term health and security.
Thanks, Jasmine. We'll now turn to each of our other panelists in turn to learn a bit more about each of these three top-line findings. First, we'll turn to Francisco in Colombia to hear about how illicit drug economies have shaped formal peace processes there and how peace agreements can expose borderland communities to new and different forms of violence. Over to you, Francisco.
Thanks, Karen. Well, Colombia, after 4 or 5 solid decades of civil war, witnessed the signature of a peace accord between the government and the country's main guerrilla, the FARC, in 2016. This peace agreement included a large alternative development program under the name of PENIS, by its acronym in Spanish. This agreement is presently in shambles. By the way, we were perhaps the first ones to note this, but now it is generally recognized, and the unraveling of the agreement, in particular of the PENIS, poses the troubling question or questions of what was wrong with this program in particular, and more generally, what is wrong or can go wrong with alternative development, and why can peace and AD programs generate violent outcomes. So what we found was that the assumptions underlying the issuing of the PENIS not by chance, coincide with those of a substantial part of the academic and policy literature. These assumptions go in the following way. There is a sequence going from a war economy, for example, coca, to illicit and healthy economies, which constitutes a clear improvement for all actors involved, safe for criminals, perhaps. So in economic jargon, the AD program would be a Pareto improvement. And this would endow it with the nearly universal supports, and besides with an underlying participatory dynamics coming from regions desperately needed of the promotion of modernization programs. What is coming out of our research is that this picture is fundamentally wrong, both from what we could call the demand side, the characterization of the problem, and from the supply side, the characterization of the policy itself. So from the demand side, first, there is simply no sequence. AED programs have been in Colombia a standard counterinsurgent tool as much as a peace tool, very much since the 1980s. In more than a single unitary transition from war to peace, what we have in Colombia is entries and exits into and from war at different points in time and in different territories. Second, and for several reasons, the coca crops has some characteristics. They're profitable, they're smallholder based, they are labor intensive, that make them socially inclusive. So coca crop substitutions choose winners and losers. So crop substitution policies have very strong distributional dimensions that were not addressed by the pennies. Another way of saying this is that in the process of substitution, several sectors, as well as the state, face very tough trade-offs and choices. And of course, these trade-offs and choices involve very key social sectors, among which one could highlight, and in our research has highlighted, peasants, labor, and women. Furthermore, the regulation of the coca economy by different non-state actors naturally contained a significant component of violence and coercion. But at the same time, it had already arrived at certain equilibria that were destabilized by the peace agreement because simply the main regulators went out of the game. So the state would have had to account for this and provide adequate security, which it failed to do. From the supply side, the support for the pennies was not nearly universal in the least, nor it has been for different alternative development programs in the past, when they were counterinsurgent tools or when they were peace tools. Rather, AD divides both state and society, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally, and triggers difficult to solve coordination, timing, and collective action problems. From the point of view of the Colombian state, there were several coordination issues. One of them, which deserves to be highlighted, is timing, because the peace process came hand in hand with a sharp increase in coca crops. This has been investigated and analyzed. Several causes have been attributed to this, but probably it is not terribly difficult to understand or terribly strange. This would probably have happened with any other crop, celery, lettuce, you name it. When you have peace and stability, people start to produce and invest more. But the growth in coca crops rapidly undermined the support for the pennies among key actors, once again, globally, nationally, and at least regionally. And to solve this burning problem in a peace, internal and global challenges and opposition to the peace process, based on the argument that it had incentivized the growth of illicit crops, two successive Colombian administrations, the government that signed the peace agreement and its successor, tried different combinations of voluntary substitution and forced eradication. The outcome, unfortunately, has been very violent and very destabilizing. On the one hand, the state directly attacked coca-growing peasants and their leaderships. On the other, their leaderships, which are fully legal presently. On the other, it failed to provide protection to the social leaderships involving crop substitution, which were increasingly marginalized and stigmatized and targeted. As of today, at least 50 substitution leaders have been assassinated by different actors at different events, with many more of them shot and injured. So this is the situation today. And of course, this situation demands from everybody thinking of different approaches to AD and to its relationship to peace and war.
Thanks so much, Francisco. It's fascinating to hear what some of the flawed assumptions have been on both the supply and the demand side. We'll move next, I think, perhaps to hear about some other flawed assumptions. We're going to be hearing next from Patrick about how post-war borderlands in Myanmar continue to experience multiple types of violence linked to both licit and illicit economies, and where in some places the spread of drugs and associated harms worsens in times of peace. So Patrick, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. So our research in Myanmar on the GCRF project has focused extensively on the experiences and legacies of ceasefires that were agreed in the late 1980s between the Myanmar army and various ethnic armed organizations in the country's borderlands with China and Thailand. These ceasefires went on to provide a fragile stability throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and they preceded the current peace process that has been taking place in Myanmar since 2011, and have been instrumental in shaping the attitudes towards this current peace process amongst conflict actors. Our research on this earlier ceasefire period shows that despite the declines in levels of outright armed conflict, borderland populations continue to experience significant violence. And under the ceasefires through the 1990s and 2000s, there was also a rapid rise in heroin and methamphetamine production and use. Indeed, drug use had a very serious impact on many borderland populations throughout Kachin State and Shan State over the past 3 decades, and has had an especially serious impact throughout these regions. So it's become clear from our research that a major paradox emerged at the heart of Myanmar's ceasefire process, in that the very ceasefire arrangements that helped to reduce level of outright armed conflict also exposed borderland populations to an array of violent and destructive forces, of militarization, dispossession, and the slow violence of worsening drug harms. And these experiences have served to reinvigorate long-held resentment against the central government, and have now created significant challenges for the current peace process in Myanmar. So one of the issues we're reflecting on in our research is why were drugs and violence such an important part of the ceasefire experience, and what can this tell us about efforts to periods of ceasefire or peace? And the research shows very clearly that drugs became a key part of informal political settlements, that negotiations around the drug trade in terms of who had the right to be involved with drugs and with what levels of protection and impunity became a very important part of the informal deals that surrounded ceasefire negotiations. It's also become very clear from a lot of the fieldwork interviews that we've done that drugs became very deeply embedded in localized governance structures throughout many contested borderland regions in Myanmar. And the stability that was provided by the ceasefires opened up Myanmar's resource-rich borderlands to increase trade and development. And this created a strong impetus to secure contested and fragile regions. And the army deployed local militias to act as counterinsurgency forces and to protect development projects, including oil and gas pipelines and dams. And in Shan State alone now, there are estimated to be more than 3,000 such militias. Offering militias the opportunity to run legal and illegal enterprises, including in the drug trade, became an important way for the army to strengthen the loyalty of these militia groups and to enable them to be self-financing. Many of those who sell drugs locally are directly or indirectly linked to these militia groups and benefit from the protection that this provides. It's also become very clear from our research that drugs have become closely associated with forms of borderland development. Inflows of investment into Myanmar's borderland regions led to a vast expansion in extractive industries, especially in mining and logging. They led to the growth of boom towns and a surge in cash circulation. which in turn facilitated and contributed to more widespread drug use. Large companies, for example, controlled mining sites and pushed labourers into more risky and dangerous forms of excavation, in which drug use became rife. New roads were built to facilitate trade and resource extraction, but also opened up remote areas to new flows of drugs. And boarding houses where many students were now able to travel in order to study became havens for drug use. And as one interviewee reflected, development became a double-edged sword for many populations. So from the perspective of Myanmar's military elites, the ceasefires were seen in many ways as successful. They reduced levels of outright armed conflict, they enabled the army to build a stronger military presence in contested areas, and they opened up borderlands for resource extraction and trade, which have become a key pillar of Myanmar's national economy. However, these developments came at a very significant cost for borderland populations. They entrenched local governance structures and economic systems that have continued to expose populations to violence, insecurity, exploitation, and worsening drug harms. And these experiences under the ceasefires of the 1990s and 2000s help in many ways to explain the resentment felt towards the current peace process in Myanmar, which has largely been framed through the language of achieving ceasefires and promoting borderland development in ways that have very problematic memories for many borderland populations. So I'll finish there, Karen, thank you.
Great, thanks, Pat. Finally, we'll turn to Orzala to learn about some of the ways that conflict and illicit economies are deeply embedded in the lives and livelihoods of borderland communities in Afghanistan, causing complex trade-offs between their short-term coping and survival and their long-term health and security. So I'll pass it now to you, Orzala.
Thank you, Karen. Good day to everyone. In Afghanistan, in the first phase of research, we have focused mostly on illicit trading and transporting in the borderlands of Nangarhar, which is eastern Afghanistan, and Nimroz, which is southwestern borderland in the country. Borderlands are trading spaces. They are oriented towards zones of opportunity, as price differential at the border creates also an incentive for both licit and illicit trades. One example I can share from Western borderlands, our researchers observed that fuel, which is illicit good, is traded illegally due to the differences in prices and by local traders in water bottles hidden inside the trucks that carry other sort of legitimate items. These are ways and forms that people are sort of making use of, illicit trade and illicit trades working in a combined way. Arbitrage is central to the local economy. Trade supports local livelihoods as well as major businesses, leading to processes of accumulation and investment in the borderlands themselves. And frontier boom towns like, for example, Zaranj, the capital for Nimroz province, as well as in metropolitan centers such as Kabul and Dubai. These are also considered sort of places where you can see the effects. However, it is certain that there are major inequalities in ways each one is benefiting from these forms of trades. The research is also sort of looking at the war, trade, and livelihoods. So as mentioned earlier by Jasmine, that how this illicit economy or the drug economy, for example, is affecting the people's livelihoods. We notice that the centrality of trade to local livelihoods has a long history predating the wartime, which is 40 decades in the case of Afghanistan. But it has also been accentuated by more than 4 decades of conflict, particularly in relation to the illicit drugs economy. During the war years, borders become more porous, and the economies of the borderland become more integrated into those of the neighboring countries. Traders built up major portfolios of licit and illicit goods, such as talc, consumer goods, drugs, tea, rice, sugar, and also people, etc. Routes are also shifted according to the dynamics of the conflict, the new forms and regulations by state and non-state actors. In a high-risk environment, drugs enables poor people to manage the risk. It gives them access to credit and inputs. It also gives them access to markets. It's easily concealed and transportable, and drugs can also be grown and transported along with other licit crops or commodities. In other words, drugs are low-risk crop in a high-risk environment. There's also a strong link and relationship between violence and eradication. Our research indicates that the drugs trade is no more or less violent than other illicit and licit economies. The violence of drug economies is largely related to external factors to eradicate or to control drugs, which are themselves often involve the deployment of violence or lead to violent reactions from communities and local elites. Also, the violence in Nangarhar and Nimroz, for example, are overwhelmingly shaped by the wider war and counterinsurgency efforts that are going on for decades in the country. Here, Borderlands fragility is a product of external policy environment rather than products or being directly an internal pathology of margins. We should also remember the distributive effects of illicit trades. Moving commodities through conflict-affected borderlands involve many players and multiple points of friction, choke points, and borders, internal as well as external, that have to be crossed. In this sense, drug economies are redistributive, and we can see these effects at the micro level, looking at the lives of farmers and traders like John Gull, whose story is told by our first life story comic. Karen, you mentioned that before. I hope our audience can have a look at that story, which is talking mostly about an ordinary farmer who is destitute and is looking for livelihoods or survival, and takes the routes of smuggling opium from Afghanistan all the way to Russia for simply paying off his family's household, expenses. While in the process, a lot of other people are also making incomes and benefiting from this process. At a wider level, we can see that the effects of this in terms of the employments that are generated as a result, the second order effects in terms of frontier boom towns with their tea houses or restaurants, hotels, shops, and so forth, all of which are fueled by the drug economy and other forms of licit or illicit trades. This is also highlighted in the drugs ban in ways that drugs ban can have a devastating impacts on the local and wider economy that has to be taken into consideration. Finally, the trade-offs and Faustian bargains also are a factor that has to be highlighted. In John Gull's story, the story of a local farmer ending up becoming a drug smuggler, it is highlighted that drug smuggling networks are shaped by underlying power relations. Low-level smugglers take high risk in crossing borders, whereas the more powerful are able to insulate themselves through brokering mechanisms and patronage relations. Therefore, there are trade-offs and Faustian bargains at all levels, from the poor farmers who are engaged in the cultivation for survival, but often at the cost of, indebtedness and risks of eradication, to the drug smugglers like John Gull who trade, short-term remuneration for a long-term risk. Similarly, at the wider level, in frontier boom towns, growth and investment are often come at the cost of growing inequality and violence. I'll just end here.
That's great, thank you, Orzala. So we've heard a selection of findings from across the project. They've talked about trade-offs, they've talked about contradictions, they've talked about paradoxes. I'm now going to turn back to Jasmine to reflect on what these findings and others from across the project imply for finding pathways out of conflict in the borderlands.
Thank you, Karen. So I think from those presentations, we can see a lot of common threads in terms of findings across the three countries. And in terms of what it implies for pathways out of conflicts, we can reflect first on conventional solutions. So conventional solutions for transitioning from war to peace typically involve governments aiming to pacify and establish control over borderlands. Often this is done through various policies to extend the reach of the state, which could be, for example, various development projects. And in drug-producing areas, as we've heard, it's often manifest through various counter-narcotics measures. But our research suggests that counter-narcotics and development policies constructed at the national level may not be that effective. Peace and development don't necessarily always go hand in hand. There are trade-offs between different measures, which imply a need for a stronger focus on distributive costs of policies designed to tackle illicit economies, and more analysis of who wins and who loses. So it's not only about trying to fix the margins with development. What's needed is a focus on how policies that emerge from metropolitan centers, whether agricultural policy, infrastructure investment, or border management, may disadvantage border regions.
Thanks, Jasmine. I'd now like to invite each of our panelists in turn to reflect briefly on the challenges of some of the ways that pathways out of conflict have been approached in the borderlands where we're working. And I will first turn to Patrick to hear a little more about Myanmar.
Okay, thank you, Karen. So our research in Myanmar shows very clearly how the country's current transition and peace process looks very different when viewed from the perspective of those living in borderland regions. Political and economic reforms launched in Myanmar since 2010 inspired hopes that the country was embarking upon what the World Bank dubbed as a triple transition, from authoritarian military rule to democratic governance, from a centrally directed economy to a market economy, and from 60 years of conflict in the country's border areas to peace. However, amidst Myanmar's post-2010 transition, the country's borderlands have experienced the most deadly outbreaks of violent conflict for more than 20 years. Much external engagement with Myanmar has been based on the assumption that opening up political space at the centre through supporting the country's democratic transition and the national level peace process would provide the foundations for peace building and development throughout the country's borderlands. However, this approach fails to account for how the political transition that has taken place at the centre and renewed violence in the margins since 2010 are intimately connected. So the current transition in Myanmar since 2010 has partly been founded upon the army's consolidation of control over the country's restive borderlands, the extraction of revenue from these regions, and the expansion of cross-border ceasefire period. All of these changes through the 1990s and 2000s contributed to a sense amongst Myanmar's militants that they were in a strong enough position, both politically and economically, to embark upon a staged transition towards democracy and opening up the country. However, there were very few foundations here for inclusive peace that addressed long-standing grievances. As I briefly reflected upon earlier, for people in Myanmar's borderland areas in Kachin State and Shan State, where our project focuses, processes of state building and borderland economic development were experienced in terms of ongoing forms of violence, militarization, and forms of highly unequal borderland developments that enriched the few but provided few foundations for broad-based economic opportunities. Development mostly created jobs that were hazardous, such as in mining areas where safety concerns were absent and drugs were rife. In light of these experiences, the narratives now surrounding the current peace process in Myanmar of the importance of reaching a nationwide ceasefire agreement and of promoting borderland development have been treated with increasing concern and skepticism. At the same time as the central government now feels in a strong enough position to push forward this agenda. These tensions between sort of a state-centric perspective of the past 20 years and the perspectives coming out from the country's borderlands help to explain worsening tensions amidst the current peace process and why armed conflict has broken out in many places, despite there being a formal peace process at the centre. So this borderland lens emphasises the need to situate the current peace process within a deeper understanding of contested and unresolved processes of state building and centre-borderland relations, especially the troubled legacy of the earlier ceasefire arrangements. Indeed, in many ways, the rush to engage in Myanmar following the country's 2010 general election outpaced the ability or the willingness to fully understand the experiences of borderland populations over the previous 2 decades. Policymakers have emphasised that the key to addressing armed conflict and illicit economies in Myanmar's borderlands lies in integrating these regions into national political structures and regional and global markets. As Jasmine mentioned, there's a powerful narrative that peace and development come together, and that peace building, state building, and counter-narcotics are all mutually reinforcing. However, our research in Myanmar shows very clearly that the challenges in borderland regions of violence, drugs, poverty are not simply a legacy of armed conflict, disorder, and state fragility, but are actually embedded in the very processes of borderland development and expanding state authority that are usually set to cure these ills. And just to conclude, these insights draw attention to the fact that peace building and development should not simply be seen in terms of integrating borderlands into national political structures and global markets, but there needs to be a much greater focus on how borderlands are integrated, on whose terms, and in whose interests. And through this, there's a compelling need to widen the policy space for a set of discussions and reflections on how to address deep-seated drivers of conflict and to support sustainable development that can bring opportunities to impoverished borderland populations, rather than rolling out the same kind of narratives and borderland development schemes that in many ways have been deployed in various guises in Myanmar for the past 30 years. So I'll finish there, Karen. Thank you.
Thanks for those insights, Patrick. It's really fascinating. It'll be interesting when we hear now from Francisco to hear the echoes of that. Francisco, it would be great to hear from you now to reflect on the challenges of the pathways out of conflict in Colombia's borderlands.
Well, there are many analogies, Karen, between what Patrick was saying and what is happening in Colombia, with the obvious differences, but there's a huge amount of comparability here. So we have analogous narratives, and this is not by chance because the problem is global and the discourses are global. So let's say from the perspective of policy relevant findings, what we might want to highlight here, I speak in plural because this is an issue that has been thought and discussed by the Colombian team, and I should acknowledge that I'm picking up ideas that come from the team, not only from me. Let's say the first issue is what is the implication of taking seriously distributional issues and taking seriously the fact that both actors in the borderlands and decision makers, coalitions, political coalitions, intermediaries between region and nation face tough trade-offs. So let's say maybe the first implication would be that substitution policies cannot, let's say for Colombia, substitution policies cannot and should not duck serious distributional issues. And what we have found, which may sound very simple, but it deserves to be put explicitly over the table, is that when we speak about distributional issues, it's not only about the income or assets, but also about harm and risk. As of today, policies in all these dimensions put prohibitive costs on the shoulders of the most vulnerable actors of the coca economy, which are the peasants, and even more the labor. So policymakers ought to craft very basic democratic principles and humanitarian principles, which, by the way, are explicitly put into the SDGs and many of these instruments, according to which there is an upper threshold for the costs that can be imposed on vulnerable populations. So otherwise, what we are witnessing and what we are presently witnessing in the Colombian context is policies which are very unbalanced and where a political majority and government coalitions put costs without bounds over certain populations. And this is simply not sustainable from the perspective of democracy, but also from the perspective of peace. Second, evaluation is fundamental. The Benin's policy had many very positive aspects, starting with the fact that it gave voice to the peasants involved in substitution, and it assumed correctly that these peasants wanted to get involved in some kind of transit from illicit to licit economies, and that they were actually willing to forego part of their income, of their already modest income, to get involved in that transition. But even despite these positive aspects, it unraveled. So a big, an important story here is how can we understand the success or the successes, the partial successes and the partial failures of these peace-oriented alternative policies, which means that probably also the focus should be in sustainability. So what we have witnessed in the Colombian context is once again several policies tailored to address very specific problems and contexts, which rapidly unravel when the context and the set of actors involved in the policy change. So I think a big question is how to make sustainable policies that address the issue of illicit economies in the transit from war to peace, or in the entries and exits from and into war and peace.
That's great. Thank you very much, Francisco. Finally, we're going to turn to Orzala to hear about what the findings in Afghanistan imply for pathways out of conflict in the borderlands there.
Thank you. Following to my colleagues presenting pathways from Myanmar and Colombia, I think Afghanistan is also not entirely different from that. But let me begin with, the importance for the policy and decision makers. I think the policymakers need to have more honest conversation about the trade-offs involved in pursuing multiple objects: counter narcotics, security, development, state building, border management in drug-affected borderlands. Not all good things can come together. So the first need for that we sort of highlight in terms of pathways is for a long-term and holistic approach. Drug economies have a very long history and are deeply embedded in the lives and livelihoods of border communities. Forms of innovation and adaptation to a conflictual and dynamic context, inputs, finance, and credit, transportation, intelligence, and information and technology, etc. So for this reason, there is a need for a long-term sort of holistic approach. And therefore, substituting an alternative crop, in this case, my organization, AREU's extensive research has been confirming this for a long time, highlights that it will never work unless the border settings, and particularly the risk environment, is transformed, which would involve a whole package of, sequenced measures aiming a large-scale structural change. Secondly, don't stigmatize those involved in drug economies. As farmers or small-scale traders, they are not greedy narcos motivated by profit. Don't stigmatize them, listen and learn from them. instead. That's specific recommendation for policymakers. And thirdly, there is a need for thinking more carefully about the distributive costs of policies directed towards the borderlands and the trade-offs involved. Counter-narcotic policies tend to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable, least powerful, whilst they tend to shift the balance of profit towards those with more assets and power. And the case of Afghanistan is very salient in this particular example. Border regulations, which has increased significantly in both borderlands in the case of Afghanistan, partly because of concerns of security and terrorism, has also is going to have a major effect on the livelihoods of local borderland communities. Therefore, we need to ask who bears the cost of these policies and to think more carefully about their second-order effects and negative externalities. Fourth and finally, every borderland is unique. Therefore, there is a great deal of subnational variations in terms of pathways out of armed conflict, and the policymakers need to think more carefully about subnational variation and to tailor their approaches accordingly. This is an example also shared probably across the project with the different contexts that we look. For example, in a politically salient borderland like Nangarhar, interventions must take local realities into account and align with wider variety of political settlement across the country. These are mainly the recommendations or way forwards so far. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. So we've heard from you, from Patrick, from Francisco, about the fact that our research in all three countries does suggest a need to do things differently, to find sustainable pathways out of conflict, as Francisco noted. Jasmine, could you just make some final remarks to draw together some thoughts about how we might approach this?
Yes, thanks very much. I think we've already heard from all of the speakers a lot of common threads throughout the three countries. What I'll do is maybe just rehash a few of the findings that I think suggest some shifts towards how things might be done differently in some circumstances, how we can improve research in these borderlands, et cetera. So first and foremost, as we've heard, I think it's very important to listen and learn from the perspectives of borderland communities. And so in order to do that, we need to pay close attention to who wins and who loses from policies aimed at tackling fragility in the borderlands. We can learn from how integration, development, counter-narcotics, and peace-building policies actually play out on the ground. And so to do this, we need to invest in good data collection, monitoring and evaluation, et cetera, at subnational levels to give us the tools in which to evaluate different policies. On a related note, when we're talking about violence, it's really important to prioritize violence reduction at subnational as well as national levels. So if you look at, for example, a lot of the prevailing data sets on violence, they're often collected at a national level. And so what you might see following a peace agreement is a national level reduction in violence, but for people living in the borderlands, that might not be the case. You might have rises of violence, you might have different kinds of insecurity and violence that are taking hold in those areas. And so it's really important to look at it holistically and also looking at the subnational, at the borderland level as well. The issue of trade-offs, I think, has come up multiple times during this discussion. And I think, just to reiterate this point, it's very important to confront the trade-offs between different policies, moving beyond the claim that promoting peace and development, tackling drugs, and addressing livelihood insecurities are all mutually reinforcing and can all be done at the same time. As we've heard from many of the speakers today, sometimes, for example, if you go very hard on tackling drugs, you might increase insecurity and you might damage people's livelihoods. And so I think policymakers just have to take a very pragmatic and honest look at what these trade-offs are when designing policies. Turning to international organizations, what we've observed is that there is a disconnect between the way that different international organizations approach illicit economies. So on the one hand, you might look at country diagnostics of the World Bank. In all three countries, they barely mention illicit drug economies. On the other hand, the illicit crop monitoring surveys of UNODC barely touch on issues of unemployment, income distribution, or market access for illicit crops in all three countries. So we recognize that organizations have different mandates and expertise, but when they're often working in silos, the problem is that the issues they're trying to address are interconnected. And so what we hope are that findings from this project may be used for bridging that disconnect, because they might have relevance for many different aspects of policymaking for many of these organizations. And so this leads me to the final point, which is about targets and indicators. So how do we measure success in the borderlands? So if we look at Sustainable Development Goal 16 for peace, the related targets and indicators do not consider currently how illicit drug economies are a relevant factor in peace building. We still have these flawed assumptions that persist, that borderlands and illicit economies are sources of instability, and that communities engaged in illicit crops are peace spoilers. But our research doesn't show that that's necessarily the case, as is evident from what we've heard today. And again, looking at this issue of data, the SDG monitoring system is based on countries reporting compliance with targets and indicators. So that means that progress is aggregated and very little is known on the subnational level, where monitoring is all the more essential. So this is what we're trying to do with this project, is address these gaps. And we're hoping that our project can focus attention on these issues.
Thanks so much, Jasmine, for those final remarks, which draw today's session to a close. Today, we've heard about some of the really rich findings from the drugs and disorder research and begun to get a sense of what they imply for pathways out of conflict in borderland communities. On Thursday, the 13th of August, next Thursday, we'll be developing these ideas further with a live panel discussion and an opportunity for audience questions and answers. We really hope that you can join us then. In the meantime, please do continue to check in with Fragility Forum events and to subscribe to the Fragility Forum YouTube channel, Fragility Forum 2020, to view this webinar amongst many, many other fascinating offerings. Many thanks.